This is Shalom World Podcast.
Uniquely to Hebrews, Jesus is not just the sacrifice, but he's also the priest, the one who offers the sacrifice. Hello and welcome back to Voyage. My name's Richard Ounsworth, and I'm taking us through the letter to the Hebrews. We're at chapter 4 of the letter now. Let's have a brief recap of the story so far. In chapter 3, the author has been talking about Psalm 94, the last sort of third of that psalm, in which God speaks about how he was made angry by his people and swore as a result of his anger at their faithlessness that they would never enter into his rest. And we discovered that the author of Hebrews links this psalm to a particular event in the story of Israel's wilderness wanderings. The moment at Kadesh Barnea, which is related in the book of Numbers, where the people of Israel had the opportunity to enter into the promised land, but they believed the 10 dishonest spies who told them that they wouldn't be able to enter and take possession of it. They disbelieved the 2 truthful spies, Joshua and Caleb. Even Moses himself lost faith at this point. Only Joshua and Caleb believed. And so God said that only Joshua and Caleb, out of all of that generation, would be able to enter into the land. He's told us that Jesus is superior to Moses in regards to faith. And now we realize that Joshua is superior to Moses in regards to faith. And of course, Jesus and Joshua are the same name in Greek and in Hebrew. It's just in English that we make a distinction between them. So we realize that he's making some kind of link between Jesus and Joshua. And then I finished by suggesting that perhaps Caleb, whose name means whole heart, is in some way supposed to be linked to us as wholehearted, faithful disciples of Jesus. We come then to chapter 4, and he begins, "Therefore, while the promise of entering his rest is still open, let us take care that none of you should seem to have failed to reach it." So there is some rest that still remains. The promise that we wouldn't enter into God's rest, I explained last time, the way it's phrased implies that God can break that promise and allow people to enter his rest, but only if he brings a curse upon himself, perhaps even the curse of death. Now Hebrews is telling us there is still this promise of entering his rest that remains. That, of course, was the promise that he made to Abraham, that he would live in a land flowing with milk and honey. And we've already seen that for Hebrews, because it's still the today of Psalm 94, we are still in the same situation, in a certain sense, that the people of Israel were in all those hundreds and thousands of years ago at Kadesh Barnea. They were on the threshold of the promised land. They could go in if they wanted to, but they lacked faith, so they couldn't. We are now in that similar situation, except the promised land isn't just the land of Canaan. And we have to make the same decision. Do we trust God? Do we believe we can make that final step? Or do we fall back at the last? And he is worried, so he's once again exhorting us. Let us take care that none of you should seem to have failed to reach it. He goes on in verse 2, "For indeed the good news came to us just as to them, but the message they heard did not benefit them because they were not united by faith with those who listened." The good news came to us just as to them. He's using a word here in the Greek which is related to the word for gospel. So what he's telling us is that the people of Israel, all those hundreds and thousands of years ago, had in some way heard the gospel, the same gospel that we have heard. How can that be true? Well, let's think about the message that they did hear. They heard Joshua and Caleb saying to them, yes, we can enter into the promised land. God is faithful. He will bring us in. Is that in some way the same as the message that we've heard, the gospel message we heard from Christ and his apostles? And I think it is, as long as we realize that the promised land that we have been promised is not some geographical part of the earth, it's heaven itself. It's entry into God's life, entry into friendship with God. That is the fundamental message of the gospel, that God wants us to be not just his children, but his friends. He wants to share with us his very life. And I think that Hebrews is telling us that we can see, as it were, the same shape of that message in the message that Joshua and Caleb gave when they returned from spying out the promised land. We are on the threshold. We can enter in. It's up to us whether we want to take that final step. Now, the second half of this verse is one of the most problematic in all of the New Testament. We've already seen one example of this where the Greek has gone a little bit wrong. One has to remember that all of the manuscripts that we have of the Greek New Testament, which is the language it was written in, all of those manuscripts are hundreds of years younger than the New Testament itself. So we don't have what the author of Hebrews wrote. We don't have what the evangelists wrote. What we have is copies of copies of copies of copies of what they wrote down. And when people make copies, they make mistakes. Things start to go wrong. And we have to try to reconstruct what it might be they originally wrote down. And sometimes the cleverest biblical scholars in the world find themselves at a bit of a loss. And when you pick up your sort of academic copy of the Greek New Testament, you see that the whole text is covered in footnotes and brackets and signs of confusion. And this is an example of that. So he might have written, as I read to you, the message they heard did not benefit them because they were not united by faith with those who listened. Or he might have written, it did not meet with faith in those who listened. Maybe you think it doesn't matter at all. Ultimately, what matters is that, well, we have to respond with faith to the message that we hear, the message we hear from the apostles, which is analogous to the message the people of Israel heard from Joshua and Caleb. We have to respond with faith when we hear that message, but also we have to be united in faith with those who listened. But if he did speak about being united with faith in those who listened, which actually I think is probably what he did write, then the question is, well, who are those who listened? And I think the distinction is between listening and hearing. All of the people of Israel heard Joshua and Caleb speak the truth, but they didn't listen. Who listened was only Joshua and Caleb. They had listened to the voice of the Lord, and therefore they were able to respond with faith to what they saw and to speak faithfully about what they had seen, even though nobody listened to them. And remember that psalm, which was being quoted in the previous chapter, the quotation begins, "Oh, that today you would listen to his voice." Not just hear it, but pay attention to it, believe it, and make a response to what's been said to us by God and by the church. He goes on to say this, For we who have believed enter that rest, just as God said, as in my anger I swore, they shall not enter my rest. Actually, we should translate it slightly better. We who have believed are entering into that rest. What Hebrews is telling us is that even as he speaks, even as he writes this letter or preaches this sermon, we are in the process of entering into the rest of God. What that rest is precisely hasn't yet been explained to us, but it's about to become clear. After he's finished re-quoting that particularly important end passage of the Psalm, Psalm 94, he says, though his works were finished at the foundation of the world, for in one place it speaks about the seventh day as follows, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And again in this place it says, they shall not enter my rest. Now this is a very difficult argument to follow. We're fortunate that we know about how the Jewish rabbis at the very beginning of the first century were arguing and how they were interpreting the scriptures. And we know about a particular interpretative method that the rabbis had, which probably was being used as early as the first century. And it's a method known in Hebrew as Gezerah Shawah. What that means is this. If you find in a particular passage of the scriptures a word where you're not sure what it means, what you need to do is look for where that word occurs elsewhere in the scriptures, and whatever it means there, we can suppose that it means the same thing in our more mysterious passage. So what he's saying to us now, I think, is God swore they shall never enter into my rest. What is this rest that he's talking about? Well, we read somewhere that God rested from all his works on the seventh day. We read about that, of course, at the end of the account of creation at the beginning of the book of Genesis. God rested on the seventh day. That's where the Sabbath comes from. So the implication, I think, is that the rest that God is really talking about in the psalm is his eternal Sabbath rest, the rest that he entered into when he had completed his work of creation. It's worth saying, I think, that of course God didn't literally stop doing anything 6 days after he began creating the world. God's work of creation is always ongoing at every moment. God is creating the world, holding everything in being. St. Thomas Aquinas tells us that God is pure act. For God not to be acting would be for God not to be God. But speaking poetically, we can hear this reference back to the account of creation in Genesis and recognize that while God is always working, he is at the same way, in some other sense, always at rest. God's life is a life of perfect rest, a life of perfect peacefulness and joy and celebration. And it's worth mentioning at this point that strong association between rest and the Sabbath does bring with it ideas not just of doing nothing, but of celebration. The Sabbath is a day in which we particularly celebrate our relationship with God. For the Jewish people, if they lived in or around Jerusalem, they might well make a journey, a short journey, because there are rules about that on the Sabbath. They might well make this journey to the temple on the Sabbath, so that the temple becomes a place particularly associated with the celebration of God's rest and our participation in that rest, which we enjoy every Sabbath day. But the people of Israel also knew that when they celebrated the Sabbath every Saturday, what they were really doing was not just looking back to when God rested from all his works on the seventh day of creation. They were also looking forwards to a time when the whole of Israel, and through Israel the whole of humanity, it was hoped, would finally and definitively come to share eternally in the rest, the peace, and the joyful celebration, which is the very life of God. So I think that's what he's suggesting to us here when he quotes, God rested on the seventh day from all his works. It might just be worth mentioning that that quotation might not be from Genesis. It might be from a passage in the book of Exodus, where God has given the law to Moses, and in particular the passage which immediately follows God giving the law to Moses is the passage about the golden calf. When the people of Israel have lost faith, Moses has disappeared up the mountain, and Aaron makes a golden calf for them and says, "This is your God," and they all worship him. And then Moses and Joshua come down from the mountain and hear what's going on and realize that something terrible has happened. That's worth mentioning, if only because it's another instance of the people of Israel losing faith in God, and it's an instance which closely associates Moses with Joshua. In these early parts of Exodus, Joshua is a minister to Moses in the tent of meeting. And in fact, in one place we are told that when Moses went away from the tent of meeting, Joshua did not depart from the tent. That's going to be important later on, so bear that in mind. But let's move on. So, he's quoted, God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And he continues, and again in this place it says, they shall not enter my rest. Since therefore it remains open for some to enter it, and those who formerly received the good news failed to enter because of disobedience, again he sets a certain day today, saying through David much later, in the words already quoted, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. I think this is one of the most difficult passages to follow the argument of, really, in the whole of the New Testament. It's a very dense piece of argumentation. What he's saying now is that the rest that he's speaking about in the psalm can't simply have been going into the land of Canaan, even though in one sense, Hebrews wants us to understand that that is what the psalm is all about. It is specifically referring to that passage in Numbers 13, 14, 15. But in another sense, it must be about something else, because he says today, and it's still today, so it must have some continued relevance and application to us. And the psalm, he takes it for granted, comes from the mouth and the pen of David, the psalmist. And David, of course, lived much, much later than that wilderness generation. David lived in Jerusalem. David lived in the promised land. So then he goes on to say this, if Joshua had given them rest, God would not speak later about another day. Joshua did lead the people of Israel, unlike Moses, because Joshua did have faith. Joshua did lead the people of Israel into the promised land. And yet, this psalm speaks about not entering into God's rest. So there must be some other rest that Joshua didn't give the people of Israel. If Joshua had given them rest, he would not have spoken later about another day. Before I go on, I want to tell you about the first time I ever read the letter to the Hebrews, or at least the first time I ever read it in Greek, which I'm always telling people is really the only way you can read it. If you don't learn Greek, you can't really read the Bible. You can only read somebody else's translation. So do learn Greek if you get the chance. If you don't, you'll have to trust people like me. Anyway, I was reading it in Greek and I came across this verse and it completely stumped me. Because what I read was, if Jesus had given them rest, he would not have spoken later about another day. Because, as I've already mentioned, the Greek for Joshua is Jesus, and that's Jesus. So I was hugely puzzled. I thought to myself, why is the author of Hebrews now criticizing Jesus for not giving us rest? Surely that's exactly what Jesus does, and surely the author of Hebrews doesn't have a problem with Jesus. So I was baffled. I checked again and again. I hadn't misread any of the words. So finally, of course, I cheated and looked in an English translation, and there I saw that Jesus wasn't Jesus, it was Joshua. And it really struck me. Actually, it gave me the idea which became my doctoral thesis. But it also occurred to me at that time that perhaps when people first heard this, they would have done the same kind of mental double take, that sort of blink and, oh, I see what you mean, that I had to do. It would have struck very powerfully the first hearers of the letter to the Hebrews that Jesus and Joshua have the same name. I've already suggested to you that Hebrews is inviting us to find some kind of relationship, some kind of analogy between Jesus and Joshua. I think now he's really driving the point home by using the word Jesus to refer specifically to Joshua, the son of Nun, and not, as we might call him, Joshua, the son of Mary, Joshua, the son of God, who we call Jesus. And in fact, I've come to the conclusion that what Hebrews is inviting us to see is what scholars call a typological relationship between Jesus and Joshua. The language we use would be to say that Joshua is a type of Christ. What do we mean by that? A type is in some ways a foreshadowing, or as it were, an echo in advance of somebody or something. A historical typology, as this one is a relationship between two figures or two events, two processes or two places, one in the past, the other in the present, or one in the present, the other in the future. In this case, a relationship between Joshua and Jesus. But there's a fundamental difference. Because Jesus is God, do you remember at the very beginning of Hebrews, we were told that the Son of God is the exact imprint of God's very being. Jesus isn't just a mark made by God in history, like stamping your seal into some wax or stamping half a potato down on a bit of paper covered in paint. It's not like that. Jesus isn't just another imprint. Jesus is the thing that God uses to make his imprints. So if Joshua is this type of Jesus, then Jesus is the seal with which the image has been stamped onto Joshua. I hope that makes sense. It's a difficult kind of idea to understand, I think. But the sense is that Joshua's whole life, and especially those aspects of his life which are theologically significant, Joshua is formed by Jesus. He has been shaped by the Son of God. His whole life is deliberately by God in his providence made into the shape of Jesus. As we go through Hebrews, we'll see other examples of this kind of typology where things are the same shape as other things, but they get that shape fundamentally from Jesus's divine and saving power. So let's bear all of that in mind as we continue with our reading. If Joshua had given them rest, God would not speak later about another day. So then, a Sabbath rest still remains for those who enter God's rest. They also cease from their labors as God did from his. So here he's just reiterating his point. The true Sabbath rest, the true rest into which the psalm refers to the possibility of entering, albeit only over God's dead body, as I suggested to you in our last episode, that Sabbath rest is only foreshadowed by the land of Canaan, the land flowing with milk and honey. The real Sabbath rest is God's life, God's eternal rest. So just as Joshua foreshadows Jesus and his life is shaped by Jesus, so the geographical area of Canaan, the promised land, the Holy Land, Israel, call it what you will, that really only foreshadows heaven itself. And the conquest of the land, which was undertaken by Joshua, we read about that in the book that takes his name, that conquest only really foreshadowed the way in which Christians can enter into heaven itself. But in order to do that, we are going to need a leader. Who is that leader? Well, of course, it's Jesus. And you might remember that Jesus has already been referred to as the pioneer of our salvation. That was in chapter 2, I seem to remember. Jesus is the one who is at the vanguard of his holy people. As Joshua stood before all the people of God and led them through the river Jordan into the promised land, so now Jesus is our forerunner. He is the one who is at the head of the mighty army of the Christian church, now entering into God's rest. And remember, I said we should read this verse a few verses ago. We who have believed are entering into that rest, just as God said. We are being led by Jesus, even now, into the rest of God. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest, so that no one may fall through such disobedience as theirs. That really sums up the whole of the message of everything we've read from the beginning of chapter 3 up to the present moment. We have the opportunity, we can enter into God's rest if we want to, or we can be faithless, we can be disobedient, we can not put our trust in God, and then, like the people of Israel of that generation at Kadesh Barnea, we will fall by the wayside. He goes on to say something that initially doesn't seem to have any relationship to what we've just read. Indeed, the Word of God is living and active, sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing until it divides soul from spirit, joints from marrow. It is able to judge the thoughts and intentions of the heart. And before him no creature is hidden, but all are naked and laid bare to the eyes of the one to whom we must render an account. The Word of God is alive and active. What does that mean? It means that the Scriptures are not just a dead letter. They're not just history. Of course, the Scriptures, a lot of them, are history, but they are about us. Everything in the Scriptures has its present-day relevance. And the way in which we respond to the Scripture speaks about our relationship with God. It cuts to the very core of our being. That's exactly what he's saying. And he uses actually a very strange word. I think here it's translated as laid bare. The word in Greek is rather marvelous, tetrachelismena. And what that means is that we are being held by the throat. It's related to the word trachea in English. It's as if God is wrestling with us, like he did with Jacob in the book of Genesis. And he's got us in a full Nelson, and he's holding us, and our throats are sort of being pulled back and laid bare so that if he wanted to, he could throttle us. God has us completely in his grip. We can't hide anything from him. And it's his word directed to us, speaking immediately to our hearts, that determines how we stand in relationship with God, whom he describes here as the one to whom we must render an account. We then have a big pause, but we haven't got to the end of chapter 4 yet. I imagine if the author of Hebrews was going to do his own chapter headings, we would be in another chapter now, but he didn't. The chapters came along a bit later, so we'll continue with chapter 4 for another few minutes. And he goes on like this. Since then, we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast to our confession. Now, that one sentence sums up almost everything in the letter to the Hebrews. Firstly, he reiterates something that he said at the beginning of chapter 3, that Jesus is our high priest. In chapter 3, he was described as the apostle and high priest of our confession. And here he says, a great high priest who has passed through the heavens. And then he says, let us hold fast to our confession. So do you see how he makes those links between different bits of his text? He also tells us that the high priest Jesus has passed through the heavens. There's this idea in the Israelite mindset that there are kind of lots of layers of heaven. Sometimes they just speak about one heaven, but other times they speak about the heavens, almost like it's sort of an onion, and you can go through and higher in and further up and so on. And he's describing Jesus as moving through the heavens here. Now, he's just been speaking about another type of motion, a motion of entering into the rest of God. And the image that he's used is the image of the people of Israel entering into the promised land. Now, that we might think of as kind of a horizontal or a geographical movement going from one place to another. Here he speaks of a vertical movement, which is not so much geographical as cosmological. Jesus is going up, but of course not literally up into the sky. What happened at the ascension, what we would have seen if we were there, I don't really know, but we do know that if we were to get into a space rocket and fly up into the sky, no matter how far we fly, no matter how high we go, we'll never get to heaven. It's not a geographical movement that Jesus made, but a theological and a cosmological one. Jesus has passed up into the heavens. But at the same time, he's creating a link between these movements, the geographical one of the people of Israel led by Joshua into the promised land, and the cosmological one of Jesus as our high priest passing through the heavens. I think the implication, though by no means has he drawn this out yet, he's just dropping the barest hint here, the implication is that just as Joshua led the people of Israel into the promised land, so Jesus, as our high priest, is leading us, as it were, up into heaven. So we have a great high priest who's passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. This is the first time, actually, that the letter to the Hebrews links the title of Son of God explicitly to Jesus, though we always knew that he was talking about the same person with both Jesus' name and the title Son of God. But now he's sort of bringing everything together and echoing everything right back to the beginning of chapter 1. Let us hold fast to our confession. It's just the same message. Hold fast, be faithful, be obedient, don't lose hope, don't lose faith, trust in God. If we trust in God, we can make that pilgrimage that Jesus is leading us on to our heavenly homeland. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who in every respect has been tested as we are, yet without sin. He's reiterating that Jesus is our priest. And do you remember how I spoke about how Jesus needed to be made perfect according to the letter to the Hebrews? And that perfection was not something that was lacking in Jesus as such, but rather he needed to be made perfect as a high priest. Because the function of a priest is to create a bridge between the divine and the human, between God and human beings. And now he's saying Jesus is a high priest for us, and a perfect one, precisely because he's able to sympathize with our weakness. He knows what it is to be weak. He knows what it is to be frightened. He knows what it is to be tempted. He knows what it is to risk failure. There's this profound solidarity, which Hebrews emphasized very strongly in chapter 3 and is now reiterating. This confidence that we gain from the very fact that Jesus is our perfect high priest. He knows what it's like. In the Old Testament, when it speaks about priests, it always emphasizes how they're different from other men, how they're set apart from other human beings, how their robes and so on make them look resplendent, how they're the only ones who can go into the Holy of Holies, and so on. But that's because the priests of the Old Testament are taken from among us. They're just human beings. So all the emphasis has to be on how they are trying to get closer to the divine side of things. But Jesus starts on the divine side of things. So consequently, all the emphasis is on how he comes over to us in his sympathy and his solidarity with us. And the chapter finishes, "Let us therefore approach the throne of grace with boldness, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need." He's added a new idea here that we can approach God's throne. And we'll see that that comes up again and again. But fundamentally, the message is the same: hold fast. But reminding us that to hold fast, to have confidence in God, is to be making a journey. To be making a journey led by Jesus into heaven itself. That's where the throne of grace is. We see the book of the Apocalypse and Isaiah chapter 6 and passages in Ezekiel as well, describing how God's throne is in heaven, how heaven is, in some sense, God's throne room. But finally, I'm reminded of a passage from the first letter of St. John, who tells us we have our advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, who is just. Jesus is in heaven pleading for us before the throne of God, and also inviting us to approach that same throne, because where he has gone, we can follow. That's the end of chapter 4. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for joining us today. We'd like to hear what you thought of today's session. Share your feedback with us at podcast@shalomworld.org. You can motivate and support us today. shalomworld.org/donate. Visit shalomworld.org for more information about Shalom World podcasts. To get the latest updates, make sure you follow us on Instagram at Shalom World Podcasts. Shalom World Podcasts is now available on all online platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and others.